music from the top, just so you can get a feel, and then we're gonna do it, and then Brian's gonna do Toxic Baby Boy. All right?
Cool. Because I want to do like a rough run of everything. Okay.
Oh, baby, baby, how was I supposed to know?
Fame doesn't end when the cameras turn away. That's the part most people miss. When the spotlight fades, silence doesn't arrive immediately. What arrives first is adjustment, learning how to exist without constant direction, learning how to make choices again when decisions were once made for you, learning how to be a person after being a symbol for so long. This is where Britney Spears' story really begins. For years, her life was lived in public but controlled behind the scenes. Every appearance was analyzed, every silence interpreted, every smile treated as evidence. And when the spotlight finally loosened its grip, the world expected relief, freedom, a clean return to normal. But there is nothing normal about life after total visibility. What rarely gets discussed is how disorienting it can be when attention disappears but consequences remain, when privacy returns but identity feels fractured, when the world moves on yet your own sense of self is still catching up. Life after the spotlight is not a victory lap. It's a recalibration. It's unlearning survival patterns that once kept you safe. It's navigating independence without a roadmap. And it's doing all of that while knowing millions of people still feel entitled to your inner life. This is not a story about performances or comebacks. It's about what happens after control ends, but healing has not fully begun. About the quiet complexity of rebuilding autonomy when your past was lived at maximum exposure. To understand Britney Spears today, you have to stop looking for spectacle and start paying attention to absence, what she no longer shares, what she protects, what she is still figuring out away from the stage. Because the most difficult chapter of fame is not being watched. It's learning how to live when you finally aren't. For most people, the spotlight feels like something you step into and eventually step out of. A phase, a chapter. But for someone whose identity was shaped under constant surveillance, there is no clean exit. The spotlight does not simply turn off, it leaves residue. Britney's early fame was not just success, it was total immersion. Her schedule, appearance, voice, and behavior were structured long before she had the chance to develop adult autonomy. She did not grow into fame gradually. She grew up inside it. And when that happens, the line between who you are and what you are expected to be becomes dangerously thin. From the outside, life after peak fame looks like freedom. Less pressure, less scrutiny, more control. But that assumption misunderstands how deeply control can embed itself into daily life. When decisions are made for you long enough, choice itself becomes overwhelming. Freedom is not immediately empowering. It can be disorienting. One of the least discussed consequences of prolonged visibility is how it interrupts self-trust. For years, Britney's instincts were questioned publicly and privately. Her emotions were debated. Her reactions were medicalized. Over time, that environment teaches a person not to trust their own internal signals. When everyone else is always watching, interpreting, and correcting, you start deferring to external judgment automatically. So when the structures around her finally loosened, the challenge was not simply reclaiming control, it was learning how to use it. Life after the spotlight introduces a quiet kind of pressure. There are fewer cameras, but more expectation. People expect healing to look calm. They expect recovery to look coherent. They expect silence to mean peace. But healing is rarely tidy, especially when trauma unfolded publicly. Another complication is that visibility never fully disappears. Even in quieter moments, attention lingers. Movements are still interpreted. Posts are still analyzed. Absence is still discussed. Privacy returns unevenly. You are left with space, but not anonymity. This creates a strange tension. On one hand, there is a desire to protect what is finally yours. On the other, there is an awareness that anything shared will be magnified. That tension shapes behavior. It encourages partial expression, guarded openness, a careful balance between speaking and withholding. What often gets misread in this phase is expression without polish. When someone has spent years being filtered, rehearsed, and managed, unfiltered expression can look erratic to outsiders. But what they are often seeing is not instability, it is adjustment, the mind recalibrating after long-term constraint. There is also grief here, even if it is rarely named. grief for time lost, for choices never made freely, for versions of self that were shaped by survival rather than desire. Grief does not always present as sadness. Sometimes it appears as restlessness, confusion, or resistance to structure. After the spotlight, there is no script, no applause cue, no external validation to guide pacing. That absence can feel unsettling, especially for someone whose entire sense of rhythm was externally imposed. Silence becomes loud. Time feels unstructured. Identity feels unfinished. Another layer often overlooked is how trauma affects perception of safety. Public life taught her that visibility could be dangerous, that attention could be weaponized, that trust could be exploited. Those lessons do not disappear when circumstances change. They shape how you move, what you share, and how you relate to others. So, life after the spotlight is not about reclaiming joy immediately. It is about rebuilding safety internally, learning which boundaries are real, which fears are inherited, which reactions belong to the present, and which are echoes of the past. This is why behavior in this phase often confuses observers. People expect a return to normal, but normal was never an option. Normal assumes a baseline that was never established. What exists instead is reconstruction. Reconstruction is messy. It involves trial and error. It involves expressing things imperfectly. It involves pulling back after oversharing and oversharing after pulling back. These fluctuations are not signs of failure. They are signs of learning. There is also the weight of public memory. The world remembers Britney in frozen moments, specific performances, specific breakdowns, specific narratives. Those memories are static, but the person is not. Living under that contrast can feel suffocating. You are changing, but the reference points never do. This creates another challenge: reclaiming authorship, telling your own story when so many versions already exist, deciding what to correct, what to ignore, and what to let remain unresolved. Not every story needs closure, but the pressure to provide it can be intense. In life after the spotlight, silence becomes both refuge and risk. It offers protection, but it invites interpretation. Speaking offers clarity, but it invites scrutiny. Navigating that balance requires constant emotional calculation, especially when trust in systems has been eroded. What is rarely acknowledged is how exhausting this stage can be. There is no performance adrenaline anymore, but there is emotional labor. Processing the past, managing the present, anticipating reaction, all while trying to build a sense of self that is not dependent on external approval. Another misconception is that stepping away from fame means stepping into peace. Peace requires stability, and stability requires time. Time to experience life without commentary. Time to make mistakes privately. Time to redefine success away from applause. For someone whose life unfolded under extreme exposure, this time is both necessary and fragile. It must be protected. And protection often looks like inconsistency to outsiders. But inconsistency is part of regaining agency. It is the freedom to change your mind. Life after the spotlight is not about disappearing. It is about choosing visibility instead of having it imposed. That choice may come slowly. It may change form. It may never look the way the public expects. And that is the point. This phase is not meant to satisfy curiosity. It is meant to restore autonomy, to allow a person to exist without constant translation, to let identity form without immediate consumption. Understanding this reframes everything that comes next. It shifts the question from why is she acting this way to what does it take to rebuild a self after living without ownership for so long? Because the most important work happens when no one is watching. And for someone whose life was defined by being watched, learning how to live unseen is not an ending. It is the beginning of something far more difficult. After the initial separation from constant control, a different challenge begins to surface. The absence of oversight does not immediately create clarity. It creates space. And space, when you are not used to it, can feel unstable rather than freeing. For years, structure dictated nearly every aspect of Britney's life. Schedules were fixed, decisions were filtered, responsibility was outsourced, often under the justification of protection. When that structure dissolved, the question was no longer who controls the narrative, but how to live without one. This is where many people misunderstand life after the spotlight. They imagine release as relief, but relief assumes the presence of rest. What follows instead is orientation, learning how to decide what a day looks like, learning how to trust instinct again, learning how to sit with silence without assuming something is wrong. One of the most difficult aspects of this phase is internal permission. After years of being told what is appropriate, what is safe, what is acceptable, it takes time to believe you are allowed to choose differently. Even simple preferences can feel uncertain. When autonomy has been delayed, it does not arrive fully formed. There is also the lingering effect of surveillance. Even without formal control, the memory of being watched does not disappear. Behavior remains cautious. Expression is tested, then retracted. Boundaries are set, then questioned. This is not inconsistency, it is recalibration. What complicates this further is the public's expectation of stability. Many people assume that once freedom is restored, behavior should immediately appear calm, grounded, and coherent. But healing does not perform well. It is non-linear. It includes regression, contradiction, and experimentation. Expression during this phase often lacks polish. It can appear raw, repetitive, or emotionally uneven. To outside observers, this can feel unsettling. But what they are witnessing is not chaos. It is self-directed expression without mediation. For someone who was filtered for so long, unfiltered expression is a skill that must be relearned. And like any relearning process, it involves missteps. Saying too much, saying too little, speaking emotionally, then pulling back. These fluctuations are part of reclaiming voice. Another layer of difficulty is public interpretation. Every action is still analyzed through old frameworks. People look for signs. They search for narratives that confirm what they already believe. Growth is not always recognized because it does not align with expectations of what recovery should look like. This creates a subtle pressure to perform wellness, to appear healed enough, calm enough, normal enough. But performing wellness is another form of external control. It shifts the focus from internal progress to external approval. In this phase, privacy becomes essential, but not absolute. Total withdrawal invites speculation. Partial openness invites interpretation. There is no option that fully protects against scrutiny. Every choice carries trade-offs. This is why life after the spotlight often involves redefining what safety means. Safety is no longer about management or restriction. It is about boundaries, about choosing what is shared and what is kept, about recognizing that not every thought needs to be explained, and not every silence needs justification. Another often overlooked challenge is grief. Not only grief for the past, but grief for imagined futures, for the life that might have existed without constant intrusion, for relationships that were shaped under pressure, for versions of self that were never explored. Grief can surface unexpectedly, in moments of joy, in moments of stillness, in moments where freedom highlights what was missing rather than what was gained. This grief does not invalidate progress, it coexists with it. Life after the spotlight also forces a reassessment of identity. When fame recedes, questions emerge. Who am I without performance? What matters when validation is quieter? How do I measure success when applause is no longer the metric? These questions are difficult for anyone. They are especially difficult for someone whose identity was built under public demand. There is no template for this transition, no established path, only personal experimentation. Another complicating factor is trust. Trust in people, trust in institutions, trust in oneself. When trust has been repeatedly compromised, rebuilding it takes time and caution. Skepticism becomes a defense. Openness feels risky. This can make relationships feel tentative. Even supportive interactions may be filtered through suspicion. Is this genuine? Is there an agenda? These questions are not paranoia. They are learned responses to long-term exploitation. In this stage, healing is less about reclaiming a career and more about reclaiming agency. agency in daily choices, in emotional expression, in defining what a meaningful life looks like beyond productivity or public approval. It is important to recognize that this work happens largely out of sight. There are no milestones that make headlines, no clear markers of completion. Progress is internal, uneven, and deeply personal. From the outside, this can look like stagnation or confusion, but from the inside, it is movement. Slow movement, but movement nonetheless. Life after the spotlight is not a return, it is a reconstruction, and reconstruction takes time, patience, and room for mistakes. It requires the freedom to be unfinished. Understanding this helps shift the narrative away from judgment. It replaces expectation with context. It acknowledges that autonomy is not restored in a moment. It is built piece by piece through experience. This phase is not about proving anything to the world. It is about learning how to exist without being managed, interpreted, or corrected at every turn. And that may be the most difficult transition of all. As autonomy slowly returns, a new tension begins to emerge, one that is less visible but deeply influential. It is the tension between wanting to be understood and wanting to be left alone. For someone whose life was defined by forced visibility, both desires can exist at the same time, and they often conflict. In this phase, expression becomes complicated. Speaking feels necessary, but explanation feels exhausting. Silence feels protective, but it also feels risky. Every word carries weight, and every absence of words invites interpretation. This creates a constant calculation. How much of yourself can you share without losing what you are trying to protect? What many people miss is that after long-term control, self-expression does not immediately feel natural. It feels unfamiliar. When you have spent years having your voice mediated, simplified, or overridden, speaking freely can feel destabilizing. You are no longer reacting to instructions, but you are also no longer sure where your natural boundaries lie. This uncertainty often shows up in patterns that outsiders misinterpret. Repetition, for example, is frequently read as fixation. But repetition can also be grounding. It is a way of reinforcing ownership over thoughts that were once dismissed or ignored. Saying something again is not always about convincing others. Sometimes it is about convincing yourself that you are allowed to say it at all. There is also the issue of emotional timing. Trauma does not unfold in a linear narrative. Memories surface unevenly. Insight arrives in fragments. But public discourse prefers coherence. It prefers a clear story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. When someone's expression does not follow that structure, people become uncomfortable. That discomfort often turns into judgment. Observers begin asking why healing does not look calmer, quieter, more resolved. They expect progress to move in one direction. They expect strength to look composed. But recovery after prolonged control often involves visible experimentation, trying on independence, rejecting it, returning to it. This back and forth is not failure, it is learning. Another challenge in this phase is how past narratives continue to dominate perception. Even as circumstances change, the public lens often remains fixed on earlier chapters. People search for signs that confirm what they already believe. Growth that does not fit those beliefs gets overlooked or reframed. This creates a sense of being frozen in time. You are changing, but the reference points remain static. Your present actions are interpreted through old stories, even when they no longer apply. That mismatch can feel deeply invalidating. It also affects self-perception. When you are constantly seen through outdated narratives, it becomes harder to trust that change is real. You start questioning whether progress counts if no one recognizes it. This is where external validation can quietly regain influence, even when you are trying to move away from it. Another layer of complexity is anger. Anger often surfaces in this stage, not as aggression, but as clarity. Anger at lost agency. Anger at misrepresentation. Anger at systems that justified control as care. This anger is not regression, it is recognition. But anger makes people uncomfortable, especially when it comes from someone they expect to be grateful. Gratitude is often demanded from those who were exploited, as if suffering is invalidated by success. This expectation silences legitimate emotion and reframes accountability as bitterness. In reality, anger can be an important signal. It marks boundaries. It distinguishes between what was acceptable and what was not. For someone rebuilding autonomy, anger can help reestablish a sense of self that was eroded by compliance. The difficulty is expressing that anger without it being weaponized against you. When your emotional reactions are already under scrutiny, any intensity can be reframed as instability. This creates pressure to soften feelings that deserve space. At this stage, many people retreat further inward, not because they are failing to heal, but because they are protecting fragile progress. Healing requires experimentation, and experimentation requires safety. Public platforms rarely offer safety for unfinished emotion. This is also the point where independence can feel lonely. Control once came with constant involvement, even if it was harmful. Freedom can feel quiet by comparison. Decisions are yours now, but responsibility is too. There is no one to defer to, no one to blame. That weight can feel heavy, especially when trust in oneself is still being rebuilt. Another misunderstood aspect of this phase is inconsistency. People expect growth to stabilize behavior, but growth often destabilizes it first. Old patterns break before new ones settle. This can look chaotic from the outside, but internally it is part of restructuring. There is also the challenge of redefining purpose. When a life has been oriented around performance and productivity, stepping away creates a vacuum. What matters now? What defines a good day? What does fulfillment look like without applause? These questions do not have immediate answers, and that uncertainty is often misread as emptiness or confusion. In reality, it is exploration. But exploration rarely looks impressive. What is happening beneath the surface during this phase is the slow rebuilding of internal authority. Learning to trust emotional signals, learning to tolerate ambiguity, learning that it is okay not to explain everything. This work is invisible, but it is foundational. Without it, any return to visibility would replicate old dynamics. With it, there is at least the possibility of choice. Another important shift in this stage is how relationships are reevaluated. Power imbalances become clearer in hindsight. Support is redefined. Some connections fall away not because they were malicious, but because they were built under unequal conditions. Letting go of those relationships can feel both painful and necessary. This can further fuel public misunderstanding. Distance is interpreted as rejection. Boundaries are interpreted as hostility. But boundaries are often the first real sign of autonomy. Life after the spotlight is not about proving stability to an audience. It is about learning how to be unstable safely, how to make mistakes without punishment, how to feel without performance. That process cannot be rushed, and it cannot be judged accurately from the outside. It unfolds in private decisions, quiet routines, and moments of self-recognition that never make headlines. By this point, the question is no longer whether freedom exists. It does. The question is how to live inside it without recreating the conditions that once made control feel inevitable. This is the hardest part of rebuilding a life after the spotlight. Not reclaiming attention, but learning how to exist without needing it. Not silencing the past, but integrating it without letting it dominate the present. And this integration is slow. It resists narrative. It does not announce itself, but it is happening. Life after the spotlight does not offer closure. It offers responsibility. Responsibility to decide what stays private. Responsibility to define meaning without an audience. Responsibility to live with a past that the world still feels entitled to revisit. For someone like Britney Spears, this stage is not about proving stability or reclaiming an image. It is about learning how to exist without being constantly interpreted. That is harder than it sounds. When your life has been explained by others for so long, silence can feel like losing control, even when it is actually the opposite. What often looks confusing from the outside is, in reality, a process of boundary making. Choosing what to share, choosing when not to explain, choosing not to translate every emotion into something publicly digestible. These choices can feel uncomfortable to an audience accustomed to access, but they are essential for autonomy. The mistake people make is assuming healing should look calm, consistent, and reassuring. but healing after prolonged control often looks uneven. It involves trial and error. It involves changing your mind. It involves expressing things imperfectly and then pulling back. That is not instability. That is agency returning. There is also a deeper shift happening here, one that is easy to miss. The need for approval slowly weakens. Not all at once and not completely, but enough to change priorities. External reaction matters less. Internal alignment matters more. That transition is subtle, but it is profound. The world may still search for signs, for explanations, for evidence that everything makes sense again. But life after the spotlight is not about restoring a narrative others are comfortable with. It is about living without constantly narrating yourself. That is where real freedom begins. Freedom is not loud. It does not announce itself with clarity or confidence. It shows up quietly in the ability to say no without explanation, in the ability to sit with discomfort without performing reassurance, in the choice to let parts of your life remain unfinished and unseen. This is why judging from a distance is so unreliable. What looks like withdrawal can be protection. What looks like inconsistency can be growth. What looks like silence can be self-respect. If there is one thing this story reveals, it is that the end of fame is not an ending. It is a transition into something far less visible and far more demanding. A life where meaning is no longer measured by applause, but by safety, agency, and self-trust. And that kind of life cannot be rushed. It cannot be explained neatly. It can only be lived. If this perspective made you slow down, if it changed how you think about fame, control, and what healing actually looks like, then you already understand why these stories matter. Share this with someone who looks beyond headlines. Stay connected if you want more conversations that question what we expect from public figures when the cameras finally stop rolling. Because the most important chapters are rarely the loud ones. They're the ones written quietly after the world stops watching.